This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode with returning guest Naomi Slade. Naomi is a journalist, author, designer and consultant. She works as a writer and broadcaster and lectures on a range of specialist subjects. She's written a number of popular gardening books and, as if that weren't enough, she's also an award-winning garden designer and will be exhibiting the Flood Resilient Garden, which she's co-designed with Ed Barsley, at RHS Chelsea 2024. We're speaking about her latest book, The Winter Garden, celebrating the winter season.
I've wanted to write a book about winter gardens for a really long time. It's a time of year that I really, really enjoy. But about 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to write a book on snowdrops, which was a deep dive into a genus, a very specific genus for the first time for me. And it was absolutely fascinating. So you talk to all these people, you find out all these things, you work out how they're going to be used. And the book came out, and as I carried on talking about it and carried on, it was very popular, in fact. So I saw a lot of gardens, I talked to a lot of people, and it became obvious that that kind of real passion for snowdrops is expanding into something more holistic, a greater interest in winter gardens. Where do you plant your snowdrops? What do you plant around them? What's their context? And it dawned on me that a book, a really comprehensive book on winter gardens, was needed, needed to kind of contextualize snowdrops. But it's more than snowdrops. It's about the loveliness of the season as well, and all the enjoyable things that go on. So yes, it's got an extension of that original passion.
There's a lot of times that I've been gardening in the winter and really pining for the summer, and I'm notoriously obsessed with flowers, and so in the winter I tend to get a bit disheartened, and it made me wonder, do you feel like the winter garden is actually a bit underrated?
I feel it's completely underrated, yes. It's a time of year that gets ignored. There's this whole historical thing, people go, oh yes, we're going to put the garden to bed for winter, but actually that's a bit of a strange thing, because there's loads of things you can do as a gardener. There's pruning and mulching and, planning, planting. But more than that, it seems a waste of seasons of pleasure, months of pleasure that you could have from that space. And I think it's a bit ironic, really, that we go, oh no, winter gardens, they're no fun. Well, we make our gardens, we plant our gardens, we put the things in them. If it's not looking good, then it's kind of our fault, not the garden's fault that it's not looking completely on point. So really, for winter gardens, it doesn't have to be a less good garden than the summer. It's a different garden. The temperatures are different, the weather is different, the light is different, but it doesn't have to be less good. And that's something that I think is important to acknowledge.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also something that we should plan in advance for, because otherwise you can find yourself getting to winter and all of a sudden everything's collapsed and you realise that maybe you didn't consider that season when you were planning. So, how would you recommend best planning for a winter garden?
Well, that's really a very good point. You kind of gaily skip along through summer, everything looks lovely, and then it all drops off the leaves and you go, oh, right, I see, fine. So when I'm designing a garden, I always start with winter in mind, thinking about the bones. So you've actually got that structure, you've got that interest. I mean, summer's quite easy. You've got lots of flowers and you've got lots of leaves and things. But winter, it really shows if you haven't got those fundamentals right. But going back to your point, you have to start from where you are. So if your garden has gone completely flat, it's worth having a good look at it, thinking about the views that you do have, the structure that exists, how things could be better framed, how to include points of interest, increase the planting. And there's also the aspect of how you use the garden. So whether you just look at it, whether you want to go into it, how you move around it in different ways, perhaps. So it's kind of about building in that interest and layering up the plants and connecting to the other seasons as well. So it's a kind of quite holistic thing.
Yeah, I do wonder if people think that winter gardens tend to be mostly about things like trees and hard landscaping. Have you found that?
Yes, that's quite sort of reductive in some ways. And these things are certainly important. But I feel that sort of just concentrating on sort of structure, hard landscaping, results in a garden that's a bit sort of one-dimensional. It can feel static because these are the things that are there all the time. And they're the constants in the rise and the fall of the season. But I find that perennials and winter flowers, things like lonicera and Camananthus praecox and stuff like that, bulbs, they add detail. They're good for wildlife. I mean, you want as many different things as possible to encourage the wildlife, but they all create a sense of movement and dynamism. So it's about creating an interesting space you like, really, rather than just focusing on just a few elements. And it's not a one fixed thing, I think.
No, I think you're right. You touched on there about the wildlife aspect of it. And I think that there is maybe the desire nowadays to leave winter habitat for things. Do you think that may come at the expense of having a more groomed, kind of structured winter garden?
It's about choices. You think of something which is kind of built like Versailles when you come to a structured winter garden, lots of, nice crisp yew hedges and things. But when it comes to perennials and flowers, it's about having things that will last through. The robust grasses, the miscanthus, you're thinking about phlomis, syringiums, things which have really, really good structure, but also remembering to plant things that will arrive early. So sort of stitching it into the continuity of the seasons, really. I don't think that leaving your garden for wildlife necessarily means you don't have an attractive and enjoyable garden for human beings. I think you can kind of work that together, but just because it's for wildlife doesn't mean you can't tidy it up a bit, and you don't have to not sweep the paths and not snip down the thing that's completely collapsed across the grass. It's not abandonment for wildlife, it's curation.
Yeah, very good point. And I think people probably can't conceive of a winter garden without evergreens. Do you think that's possible, to just build one that doesn't have something in there that's got evergreen leaves?
I think evergreens are useful. I think they're quite important. They're good for structure and bulk, but it rather depends what we mean by evergreen. We think about evergreens and we're thinking Italian-shaped cypresses and box and yew and that sort of thing, holly. But actually, if you think about it, there are lots and lots of other things that are evergreen too. There's Pittosporum, which has lots and lots of different colour leaves, Sarcococca, which has attractive flowers as well, Osmanthus. And there are also sort of foliage plants that act as ground cover or as container plants, so heucheras and carex, other grasses. So actually there's a whole range of different sorts of foliage you can use. So it's not necessarily a case of putting in a formal garden and that's that. You can create something quite soft and dynamic. I think evergreen structure, particularly with a smaller garden like mine, evergreen structure is extremely useful because you haven't necessarily a lot of things to hang the view off otherwise. You do need that consistency. But in a larger garden, if you think of some of the Piet Oudolf landscapes, they look phenomenal in winter. Nary an evergreen in sight, big swathes of grasses and seed heads and, the frosted dawn quality of it all. They're absolutely glorious. So it depends on the space, the light, the context, taste, all sorts of things. But I do think we need to look beyond kind of box and yew cones, definitely, to be bigger, better, more exciting trees and a greater palette of plants.
You mentioned containers, which is, I think, a very good way of getting interest into the winter garden, but also you mentioned the view. And again, should a winter garden mainly focus really on the bits that you can see from indoors, because that's presumably where you're going to be spending a lot of your time looking at it?
Yes, I think one has to be realistic. Winter, it does get cold, it does get miserable, it rains, it can be dark and rather dreary. And whether it's all about the view rather depends on your attitude as a gardener and as an individual. But I think it really makes sense to make sure that the view from the window works. And my best trick is to round up everything else, every pot that's doing something in the garden, and put it in front of my double doors and in front of my windows. Create some lovely big containers of bulbs and a couple of specific winter containers, but give it that backbone of things you already have. So in some ways, having something nice to look kind of keeps you entertained, but also knowing that there's something good out there. So if you've got a longer view, put something in it, put something that's sort of entertaining. And another thing which I came across quite recently, actually, somebody made a good point to me, which is actually if you build your front garden up as a winter garden, then rather than having to go out into it, you actually walk in and out of it every time you go to the supermarket or pick the kids up from school or whatever. So you actually have far more interaction with the spaces you pass through every day in winter and in summer. So paying a little bit more attention to that might connect you to the gardening a bit more.
Yeah, that is a really good tip. And have you got any other tips for kind of enticing yourself or other people out into the garden during the winter if you're not necessarily that way inclined, to go out and explore it?
I think it helps if there's something really interesting to see. So if you know that the landscape's changing, and you know something's moving on, it's always tempting to go and see how it's happening. If you're there and you're at work and you're thinking, oh, yeah, maybe I'm zoning out now. Maybe I'll go for a stroll in the garden. Going, oh yes, I'll go and see if the magnolia buds have gone fuzzy yet, or see if the bulbs have poked out. I mean, I've got a modest collection of snowdrops, so it's fun to see if anything's happening there. You go out, okay, this one's come, that one's come. Excellent, it's all moving on. So again, it's about the dynamism, the dynamism of the experience and the fact that the season doesn't just stop. And it's also worth remembering that you can still pick flowers and foliage and things from the garden and bring them indoors, which can enhance the connection. So if it stops raining for 5 minutes, you can zip outside and grab something. I always go out to look at the plants, but then again, I was talking about work breaks. So going outside with a cup of tea and just putting a seat into a sunny spot and just chilling out for a moment in the garden. I think having somewhere to go, which is sheltered and warm and pleasant, is quite tempting, certainly helps.
Do you think it is worth factoring in outdoor seating or even something as daring as outdoor dining? Because there are days in the winter where you could just wrap up and go and sit out for a bit. Would you recommend including that, or would that just be maybe taking it a step too far?
I think it's nice if you can. I mean, fire pits still work, and on November the 5th, you see people running around, waving toffee apples and hot dogs, and, horizontal rain and sleet doesn't seem to slow them down. Yeah, I think it's quite nice actually. If you can do that, I mean, it's a different vibe to summer. Clearly, it's all much more muffled up, but everyone likes a fire or a different space. It sort of expands the entertaining space if you can. Stars can still be lovely. So again, it depends on tastes and it depends on the size of the garden. I mean, if you've got a garden that's big enough for a lovely big fire pit, then you're getting more out of it if you use it in all the seasons in different ways. But also, if you just have a greenhouse or a shed, popping a couple of chairs in there so that if it is raining, I was talking about having a cup of tea outside, and I don't really have a shed or greenhouse that's big enough to get into myself. But if one did, then one could sort of huddle under a blanket and just take 5 and watch the bulbs come up and have a sit. I do think winter has PR issues, and just thinking about it in a different way can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I guess artificial lighting would be another useful thing, wouldn't it?
Well, lighting's an interesting one because on the one hand, it's absolutely fundamental. So you can extend the use of the garden through artificial lighting. You can brighten things up with some pretty fairy lights. You can put little sort of gently illuminate things, which are useful for safety. And you don't want a dirty great floodlight for safety because it makes the horrible lurky shadows and ruins your night vision. So yes, lighting, sort of artificial lighting is very useful for sort of making the garden more usable, both in person, but also as you look out of the window. But you have to be a little bit careful about light pollution because animals, human beings, insects, everything have evolved with circadian rhythm for light and dark. And if you light bits that are supposed to be dark, you can quite often disrupt the local wildlife, and actually disrupt the local neighbours as well. So I think it's lovely. I think it's really nice, but shining lights into the sky is not a terribly good idea. And it's also good to put it on a timer so it turns off at bedtime. Saves money and it keeps the environment dark. I mean, dark is good. We like dark.
Yeah, so just exercise caution with that. And you mentioned obviously gardens that are heavily perennials based, like Pete Aldous. I was thinking as well, if you had a garden that was predominantly productive, so possibly veg, possibly annuals, cut flowers, is there still the place to make that attractive in the winter?
Yes, I think so. I mean, annuals aren't designed to go from year to year, so they don't tend to hold terribly long into the season. But if you have a cut flower patch, you can have something like, and it contain things like asters and dahlias and chrysanthemums and calendulas. And actually, they'll flower for a really, really long time up until the frost and the wet get them in the end. So they can carry on right into November. So it's a fairly long period of interest. So, I mean, I think with cut flowers, I think your perennials are likely to give you more bang for your buck than annuals will. But when it comes to veg, actually, that's a really interesting point because veg patches are naturally quite a structured space. You've got lines, you've got edges, you've got triangles, so you've got the borders and nice symmetrical rows of leeks and obelisks to grow things up, arches to espalier things too. So I actually find the winter veg patch a really satisfying sight. And of course, colourful with things like brassicas and chard and stuff like that. So I think when it comes to veg patches, it's worth reconsidering the space and putting in perennial crops like artichokes, putting in nice bright red lines of chard and things, and things that will hold well in winter like leeks, and sort of reconsidering it for its aesthetic as well as its flavours.
There's so many interesting things that happen in the winter in the garden, just in terms of watching how things decay, that, you couldn't really fail to find something that would capture your interest, whatever the type of garden, I think. But for me, the key is to actually get out there in it. And sometimes I need a bit of a kick up the bum. I can be a bit of a fair weather gardener. If you had any essential feature, or if you could say to people, include these one or two things that will get you out into the winter garden, that will get you interested in it, would you be able to kind of narrow it down and give me one or two?
Somewhere to sit, whatever your tastes are, find somewhere to sit down and just take it in or have a rest. Continue to use the space. Something to look at, something that you really enjoy, whether it's a sculpture or a focal point, or making most of a view that you can't see the rest of the year. And for me, plants, plants, plants all the way, stuff that's going to carry on through, things that are going to reach their peak in the depths of winter. Holly's a classic, but some of the fragrant flowers are, they're phenomenal. They're wonderful. And things that start to happen early, things like the primrose family and bulbs, just keep that movement, that dynamism. And it's like, well, I'm going to go see what's going on. It's not stopped, it's not static, it's still moving on. So, allowing yourself to enjoy it and having lots of opportunities to do so is definitely the way forward with winter gardens.
Thank you very much to Naomi for providing inspiration at a time when we're probably all feeling the depths of winter a little bit. And thank you to you for listening as well. Here's Dr. Ian Bedford with his bug of the week.
A healthy, naturally balanced ecosystem, where plant life and animals live in harmony, is dependent on a complex web of interactions that function between them. Often fragile interactions that govern the survival of individual species and the habitats where they feed and reproduce. And we'll certainly witness some of these interactions in our gardens, such as those between the flowering plants and their pollinators, the herbivores that feed on the plants, and the creatures that predate on them. But probably less obvious are the interactions on the ground and within the garden soil, with the creatures that consume dead organic matter, converting it into the natural compost that sustains nutrient-rich, healthy soils. The recyclers, creatures that include the earthworms, numerous fly larvae, and beetle grubs. However, some of the most effective recyclers are often wrongly assumed to be plant pests, such as the many slug species that only eat rotting vegetation, and the woodlice that consume decaying wood. Also, a unique group of invertebrates that were one of the first animals to appear on land over 400 million years ago, and have remained an important element of healthy ecosystems. Millipedes. Nocturnal, detritus-eating creatures with long, segmented bodies that are sometimes mistakenly referred to as pests when found feeding amongst plants that had already been damaged by other creatures. Despite similarities to centipedes, their carnivorous cousins, millipedes differ by having 2 pairs of legs per body segment, while centipedes have 1. They also differ by being able to coil their bodies into a tight spiral when disturbed, which protects their head and their many pairs of legs. Extraordinarily large numbers of legs, which obviously inspired their millipede name, meaning 1,000 feet. But following on from their classification in the 18th century, millipedes hadn't actually lived up to their name, and in fact, people who'd spent their time counting legs on the different species contemptuously called them frauds, since the highest number of legs ever recorded was 750 on a Californian millipede in 1920. However, 101 years later, during 2021, 60 metres below scrubland in Western Australia, a previously unrecorded species of millipede was discovered. A species that justifiably was a genuine millipede, with a truly astonishing leg tally of 1,306.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.